Hi, good evening. Thank you all so much for joining us this lovely evening. My name is Anirudh Kanisati. I'm going to be your host for the evening. Let me begin with a short round of introductions for all my co-panelists, and then we'll get straight to the topic at hand. Um, the event that we're all attending today is hosted by the Museum of Art and Photography, which is a new museum coming up in Bangalore. Our mission is to bring art back into the heart of the community. It's centered around a diverse and growing collection of artifacts from the Indian subcontinent, spanning a time period of over 10 centuries. We're organizing this in collaboration with the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality at Ashoka University. It's the first center in India to study the broader spectrum of questions relating to both gender and sexuality, which I hope we'll get into in this talk. And this, sorry, I think there's a bit of an audio glitch there. And this spectrum includes issues of inequality, fantasy, pleasure, identity, and politics that are key realities of our everyday lives. I'm joined today on the panel with Professor Shivaji K. Panikkar. He's a gay-identified art historian specializing in Indian art. He's recently retired from the School of Culture and Creative Expressions at Ambedkar University in Delhi, where he was the dean. And you can read more about his work and publications in the chat box. We're also joined by Seema Anand, who is a storyteller and mythologist specializing in women's narratives. Those of you who are here from our Instagram might already be familiar with Seema's work. Her research on ancient Indian folklore is affiliated with the UNESCO initiative for preserving endangered oral traditions, as she works to bring ancient Indian texts back into the public space, translated and reworked to reach multicultural audiences. Finally, with us today is Dr. Alka Pandey, who is an art historian who taught Indian arts and aesthetics at Punjab University for more than 10 years. Her major fields of interest are gender identity, sexuality, and traditional arts. Dr. Pandey is currently a consultant art advisor and curator of the Visual Arts Gallery at the Indian Habitat Center at New Delhi. You can read, of course, detailed biographies of all of us in the comments. As you may already know, I'm Anirudh. I'm a public historian focusing on medieval South India. I host a couple of podcasts and I write columns for the Print and the Hindustan Times. Thank you, Rashmi and Nishant, for joining us today as our sign language interpreters. And without any further ado, let's actually get into the discussion. I'd just like to say before we begin that we encourage all of you in the audience to ask us as many questions as you would like. I'm going to keep an eye on the Q&A box here at the bottom of your screen, and I will be looping you into the conversation that we're going to have over the next 1 hour or so. So that said, let's begin. Let's talk about sex and stone. To really kick this off, I'd like to start by trying to understand better the sculptures and the temples at Khajuraho themselves. So Dr. Pandey, Professor Panikkar, to begin with, can you tell us a little bit about how the temples at Khajuraho came to be constructed and what the significance of these erotic sculptures on them is? Yes, please go ahead.
Who should go?
You, Professor.
All right, thank you very much, Anirudh, and the hosts for putting up this discussion. Well, we know that it was in 1830s that Khajuraho was discovered, so to say, by Captain T.S. Burt. And it has actually created shockwaves right at the outset. So-called indecent sculptures these temples displayed. Next scholar who was interested in the sculptures of Khajuraho was Ferguson, and that was in 1870s. He called it obscenities that disfigure a part of sculptures. So there was a certain disgrace that was seen. Alexander Cunningham, who followed Ferguson in 1880s, was more descriptive of the temples. Now, we all know that Khajuraho was built by Chandela kings in Bundelkhand in 10th and 11th centuries. There were supposed to be about 75 temples there, of which we have about 24 or 25 which are remaining. Earliest ones are is a rather dilapidated site of Chausat Yogini temple. Clearly, instance of temple building in Khajuraho is known from Chausat Yogini. These temples are actually divided into 3 or 4 zones, these existing temples. The most prominent one is in the western zone, which has a Lakshman temple, which is of mid-10th century, Vishwanath temple, and one of the most stupendous in terms of scale is Kandarya Mahadev temple. So these 3 temples are the most prominent. There are also Jain temples. Obviously, temples were built by kings, like Lakshman temple has inscription, and the idol itself was brought from, of Vaikuntha. Vishnu was brought from perhaps hills so temples of Khajuraho occupy a very important place in the medieval architecture. They are of Nagara style of temple architecture. They are on basically on all of them are on elevated plinths, having very elaborate walls, and some temples are Nirandhara temples, that is without a inner circumambulatory path. Some are Sandhara temples, which have an inner circumambulatory path. Both inside as well as outside, you have sculptures. You have profusely decorated walls outside, particularly these 3 temples that I have mentioned: Kandarya Mahadev, Vishwanath, and Lakshman temple. And of course, Khajuraho has been noticed primarily for its erotic sculptures. And these sculptures are found on specific locations in these temples. They are not, you may find a stray example here and there, but major erotic sculptures are on the sandhis, or on the conjoining parts of the temples, where the outer wall of the temple, outer wall of the vestibule, or that space that connects the Garbhagriha and the Mandapa, the outside wall of which has actually all these major temples. Now, having said that, you have large part of the sculptures are of deities. This is something which is to be noted. Although Khajuraho is known for its erotic sculptures, there are arguments more recently that there is an over-importance given to erotic sculptures. That's why titles like Khajuraho ke Deva Murtiyan, or the gods' images from Khajuraho. So there is also adequate material or study on iconography of gods and goddesses. Apart from that, you have Surasundaris, you have rishis, you have vyalas, you have toranas, you have wonderful ceilings. There are also special mandapas built for Varaha. One particularly important is Varaha. Then, of course, there are Jain temples also there, particularly in the eastern group of temples. So it's a very, very engaging site. And by all means, who has made it are the kings. That's for sure. Would you like to get any further?
Thanks for that, Professor. So this actually opens up like a whole bunch of new questions. These are very clearly commissioned in a context, a courtly context, as you said. It's mostly these temples are commissioned by kings and members of royal courts, which brings up the question of, yes, of course, it is very important for these courts to display various gods and so on the walls of these temples. And there seems to be a suggestion in what you said that the placement of these sculptures, these Mithuna sculptures on the temples is related to the conjoining of various architectural elements. But let's just leave the architectural aspect of them aside for a little bit, because I'd like to delve more into the erotic context, which of course is what we are going to be discussing mostly this evening. Seema, if you could tell us a little more about the erotic world of the people who may have made these sculptures, given the kind of almost the exuberance and joy for sex that you see on these sculptures, what does it tell us about the erotic worlds that people who commissioned them?
So, Anirudh, for the longest time, people have had all manner of ideas, suggestions, theories about why these erotic sculptures exist. And in all honesty, when you look at those temples, the Khajuraho temples in particular, I think there's less than 5% that are typically sexual. The rest of them are basically of women in different poses, either looking in a mirror or playing with a ball, etc. And my work on these has been, it's kind of evolved over time because there's very little actual knowledge. So there's nothing really that one can delve into and say, this is absolutely it. Most people seem to think that the female sculptures are sort of side issues, and that a lot of the Mithuna sculptures are put on the outside because you leave all this outside before you enter the sanctum sanctorum. I have to tell you, very exciting, my most recent research, which has made me change my mind about all of this. Because of course, the Shilpa Shastra, the architectural Shastras do say that the idea of lovemaking couples, the idea of pleasure, was extremely important. And no matter what the building and no matter how many sculptures, there would be at least one or two sculptures always of Mithuna couples made on the outside wall to sort of say, well, bring that same pleasure and productivity into this building as well. But like I was saying, my most recent one, which is my aha moment actually, is apparently at certain times of the last couple of thousand years, the Earth has suffered from particularly violent natural catastrophes. So one has happened in around the 5th century or so, another one happened around the 15th century or so. And what has happened with each of the, and this has happened across the world. So whereas a lot of the Western civilizations at this point figured that this was the wrath of the gods, we were being punished, and the Catholic priests definitely felt that it was because of the unbridled lust of the Roman emperors, and therefore people had to be punished. And at this point, sacrifices are made, and all sorts of things are done to sort of assuage the gods' anger. Ancient India believed that this was when Mother Earth had forgotten her own pleasure, that she's actually forgotten what it feels like to be in that mode of pleasure. And we're talking about in the 5th century or so when the Kama Sutra mentions the Kama festivals, the Kamdev festivals, the love festivals. All of these were performed to bring her back to a memory or bring her back to a sense of her own pleasure so that she can be productive and happy again. And so to my mind, the way that I'm now looking at it through this new research, I think that a lot of these temples and a lot of the sculptures were made literally as prayers to Mother Earth to keep her in that mode of happiness. And I just think that, like I said, it's so different to what everybody said till now, but it appeals to me because there's just so much out there that suddenly makes sense. And so a lot of the sculptures that people go and take a look at, which are just ordinary ones, those are actually far more erotic. I mean, for me, I think the most erotic one is the woman playing with the ball. I don't know if you've seen this particular one. It's known as the Kanduk Krida, the playing with the ball. Now, of course, in the Kama Sutra and the 64 kalas, playing with the ball is one of the 64 kalas, and different sizes of balls were used for men or for women. And foreplay, a man would juggle. It was about pleasure. It was about keeping your beloved happy. So juggling, etc., was done. But we understand that women were taught how to play with a ball, a particular size ball, which is about the size of the hand, which is what you see in the sculptures at Khajuraho. And in our literature, that was supposed to be very erotic. When the woman was actually shown playing with that ball, and when she threw it up and down, and how her body moved, and how she perspired, and the color of her complexion changed, and so on, it was supposed to be extremely erotic. So if you look at our old literature, it actually, whenever the woman plays with the ball, it's always the precursor to a scene of ultimate seduction. And so it's just about actually understanding and learning what the metaphors meant to be able to understand the eroticism behind it.
That's a very interesting perspective. Dr. Pandey, I'm wondering what perspectives you might be able to offer us as far as the erotic art of Khajuraho is concerned.
Well, you know, each one of us, we like to have
Dr. Pandey, sorry, I think your video is frozen.
Is it okay now? Is it okay?
No.
1 minute, 1 minute. Yeah, is it all? 1 minute start. Is that all right?
Yes, this is good. It's good.
So, you know, what I believe in India, there is a whole thing called dhvani, which actually means suggested meaning. And the suggested meaning really comes from what Anantamurthy said, that in India, every Sanskrit word has many meanings. In the same way, Khajuraho for me epitomizes the holistic way of how Indians lived. Because if you look at the four Purusharthas, there is dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. For me, Khajuraho exemplifies the four Purusharthas. Of course, because a lot of our modern historical writing came from a slightly Victorian perspective when, as Professor Panikkar said, they were discovered at the time when the British were kind of ruling the country, and a lot of British historians wrote about it. They were mortified to see these naked, nude, beautiful, voluptuous women, men or gods, as people would like to believe, literally standing on their heads and performing the sexual act of mithuna. Having said all these things, I think it was a coming together of a very, as I mentioned earlier, a very holistic way of living, where dharma is very important, where artha, earning life, is very important, and the final liberation is very important. But there is also a very important aspect in Indic wisdom, and that is of pleasure, which Seema also has been speaking about. All our gods, our mythic legends also talk about pleasure. The Kama Sutra, one of the stories about the Kama Sutra is that it was written when Nandi really heard the love makings of Shiva and Parvati. In many of the Khajuraho panels, even though there are the Jain panels also where there are erotic sculptures, they say that it is also a celebration of the consummation of the Kumara Sambhav, of the marriage of Shiva and Parvati. So for me, actually, I think Khajuraho represents the Brahman, the cosmos, and it represents every aspect of life, all the Purusharthas of life, and Kama being one of them. So in some of the sculpture, in some of the temples, like the Kandarya Mahadev and other temples, where you have these erotic sculptures on the external facades of the temple, people have gone a little OTT over the fact, oh my God, there is all this sexual motifs. And a lot of tour guides, when I went to Khajuraho many times, I heard them telling very, very funny stories about the act of copulation or the naked women. I mean, it was bizarre. I mean, it was quite surreal. And I actually wanted to tap the guide on the shoulder and say, why are you making these stories up? So I think in the same way, there is a lot of ignorance to the real reason why the Shilpa Shastras, why, as they are called, the Vishwakarmas, made the temple, and why? Because if you see everything, we've got canons for everything, Anirudh. We've got canons for Chitra, which is in the Chitra Sutra, in the Vishnu Dharmottara Puran. We have the various canons for making the gods and goddesses in the Agam Shastras. So in the same way, the building of these temples, a deep amount of thought went into it. And as I keep maintaining, the pleasure principle being so important for us, sensuality and sexuality being so important for us in our journey of life. So these were also represented in the walls. They also said that one of the Chandela kings was really very much into the tantric cult, and he wanted to be very, very sure that there was no state of arousal or sexual arousal. So he created and got these things commissioned so that that whole think of transcendence from pleasure to moksha, it was that moment which was frozen, in my opinion. And there are also things that, why not? Why should people not see the aspects of life, of sex, of sexuality, of pleasure to be seen on the wall, so that people accept it as part of their everyday and don't go on, oh my God, what is this happening? So I personally, for me, Anirudh, this is a very holistic way of the Indian way of living.
Thanks, Professor. So at this point, Professor Panikkar, you had a comment?
No, I just wanted to add a little bit to what Seema had mentioned, if I may be allowed to do.
Of course, please.
Yeah. So what I was actually, my own research on goddesses cult in India, that had been my focal point. And two preoccupations that we find in the entire range of goddesses worship is, one is actually the birth, the giving birth aspect of woman. And the other is actually the death aspect. That is something that you would like to avoid. It's, it is inauspicious. That is not kind of encouraged. Whereas always all rituals are actually focused around the propitiation of fertility. I mean, to put it, that's how I understood what Seema, I mean, this is evidence right from the early early period of Indian art history, where you find voluptuous, this kind of fullness of women's form, all around, including symbolism like Purna Kalasha, for instance. So the perspective now coming to Dr. Pandey, what she was trying to say about the British, the Victorian kind of perspective that has been imposed on Indian culture, right, has kind of completely wiped out some of those belief systems, some of those perceptions, about life, body, and sexuality and celebration of it. Now, this is not to say that entire community of society was kind of immersed in sex and pleasure generation alone. There had been also a concept of, or preoccupation of moksha, right? So that's why you find, I would like to kind of bring into view this idea of bodhisattva, who is standing in the midst of all this sensuality in a very kind of composed, detached manner. Buddha himself is kind of withdrawn back. But this is not to reject that the world is all, sensuous, So I think I just thought of putting this two points there.
That's so. Thanks, Professor. So, I'd like to present some perspectives that I hope will add a little bit of depth to our conversation. I particularly like the idea of thinking of the temple as a representation of Brahman, of the cosmos. That's something that we can see in the work of a lot of architectural historians, especially Adam Hardy of late. And this idea that the temple is deliberately designed. If you look at, for example, the Kangarya Mahadev, with its towering kind of miniature shikharas, right? There's this real sense that it's emanating into all four directions. And therefore, it is only natural that a representation of the cosmos of the Chandelas is also going to be decorated with all the aspects that see as part of the world, including, of course, sex. And I also find it interesting to see the parallels between agrarian states as we go deep into time, right? So not just looking at India, but also if you look at, for example, early Mesopotamia or early Egypt, you see that, keep in mind, when hunter-gatherers are gradually settling down and moving into sedentary societies, there is no every part of their world is, of course, natural to them. There is no sense to them that sex is unnatural, and especially fertility of the woman, the woman's fecundity, ability to bear children, and of course, the fertility of Mother Earth, as you were saying, Seema, are very important to them. They don't see these as necessarily separate things. And I think you see that also in a lot of poetry that was produced through ancient and medieval India, where you see the lovemaking of various animals described on par with the lovemaking of the god and the goddess, or of the courtly man and the courtly woman. But it's on the courtly man and the courtly woman that I'd like to spend a little bit of time, because all of the texts that survive to us from medieval and ancient India, perforce, are the ones that were composed by the elites. So we know to a great deal of detail how the elites thought about sex, and not just about sex, but of course, as Dr. Pandey was saying, about everything, including, for example, art and so on. But what is very clear about sex is that to the courtly mind, sex was a skill to be honed. To be able to pleasure a large number of partners and to use various methods of foreplay and so on, was something that was considered to be a natural part of the education of a urbane man in ancient and medieval India, and also, of course, of the prince. Now, what I'd like to ask you is, do we have any sense of like how widely these attitudes towards eroticism were shared by society at large? And second, and of course, this is coming into somewhat more disturbing territory, I focus on medieval India, and a lot of my work looks at epigraphy. And what I've seen extensively in inscriptions is that courtly women were very often not there voluntarily. We know that medieval Indian kings fought wars with each other all the time. And we know that very often women were a casualty of these wars, either being killed by soldiers or being captured as loot and being taken back by kings. So given that most of the sources that survive were written not just by elites, but by elite men, and that depictions of sex, of sexuality, writings about eroticism were written by elite men for elite tastes, how do we deal with that morally? It is great that medieval India was a sex-positive world, but it's not a sex-positive world for everyone. It's a sex-positive world for elite men. How do we deal with that moral grayness?
Should I just start this one?
Yes, please.
Because so as I said earlier, Niruddha, my area of expertise is actually ancient India. It's not medieval India. Now, unfortunately, what we have in the way of texts, surviving texts from ancient India, are very limited. We also know that most people think that this is the time that Kama Sutra and all of society at large was terribly open-minded about things and everything was absolutely wonderful and women had a certain status. That is absolutely not correct. Women did not. There is a parallel strand of literature that is exactly as misogynistic as you would imagine any medieval or even modern day text to be. It's unfortunate, but there it is. The Kama Sutra, which is the first of the extant texts that we have, it's the first one that we have that has actually survived in almost its entirety. The Kama Sutra, to my mind, has always represented the change of narrative. I feel that when you look at some of the other texts that existed at that time and the misogyny that exists, the Kama Sutra very definitively, in section 2, as you know, it's made up of 7 sections. It talks about how a young man, a young, urbane, wealthy man should live his life in the most perfect way possible. Section 2 is about lovemaking. It's about the arts of pleasure. And that's the only place where suddenly the focus shifts. And it's all about how the woman should be pleasured because the path to heaven is based on the pleasure of the woman, or the balance of the universe is based on the pleasure of the woman. And there's such a definitive shift. And I find it absolutely fascinating that if you look at ancient erotic literatures from Japan, from China, from Persia, from any of the other ancient civilizations, they're always from a male gaze. This is the only one that I've discovered, this section 2, the arts of pleasure in the Kama Sutra, which is very definitely most of the time from a female gaze. Do you know, it doesn't even actually mention the act of sex. It doesn't mention bodily fluids. We're told that Vatsyayana didn't like the idea of bodily fluids, so he doesn't talk about them. It doesn't actually mention thrusting. It doesn't mention bodily fluids. It doesn't actually talk about any of that. It just talks about this whole idea of refinement and beauty, and continues to sort of hammer home the point that till the woman is not absolutely pleasured and happy, things aren't going to improve. Nothing is going to change. So much so that there's an 11th century commentary written by a Buddhist monk called Padma Shri. Nagar Sarvaswam is the name of the text. And Nagar Sarvaswam, but Padma Shri actually mentions this in a larger way in the introduction, where he goes on to say that he says that why should a man suddenly change the way that he's thought for years, for centuries, about his own pleasure and suddenly start looking at the woman's pleasure? You have to make it aspirational for the man. And so he says, if you bring a woman to pleasure fully, your business will do better. And then he explains how his business is going to do better. He says, if you pleasure the woman fully, you will become a better warrior. And then he gives incidents of how the man would become a better warrior. So he makes it really aspirational. Did you know that there were even battle positions in ancient times that are named after lovemaking positions? So it was very, very aspirational. And I just always believed that this is where they were trying to change the narrative of women to this non-misogynistic path. And I don't know whether it actually ties up or not, but I find that 1,000 years later, finally these 10 goddesses that come together as the Mahavidyas, all these goddesses who've existed before, suddenly they take on a dual identity and they become the Mahavidyas. They're only worshipped through tantric practices, etc. Again, these are goddesses that are talking about or rebalancing or unbalancing or disrupting the gender power positions. So I don't know. Again, this was a theory that somebody had come up with, that every 1,000 years or so, there's this wave that kind of takes place to overturn the narrative of women, to overturn patriarchal narratives. And yes, I agree that as we go on, things kind of implode, don't they? I mean, like you said, the literature as you get to medieval times is pretty bad. And the condition of women in harems is awful when you read a lot of that literature. From ancient times, we don't have enough literature to say how bad or good it might have been. I just have this text that actually talks about changing the narrative. For me, it's a very hopeful one.
All right, thanks for that, Seema. I mean, I would love, of course, to be hopeful about medieval India, but after reading all these inscriptions about women being burned alive and so on, it's difficult for me to really believe that they succeeded in really making that change really last. Professor Panikkar, Dr. Pandey, any thoughts, any comments?
I would like to add that since my work on goddesses actually proves that on one hand, they were propitiated for progeny. On the other hand, they were also barriers. Like, for instance, the case of Saptamatikas, So literature actually described them in the war front, but in the sculpture, they are represented with children. So there is that aspect about women. I mean, I would like to kind of think that women's the perception about women had been a kind of mixed. There was no one particular way women were kind of, depending on the situations, things changed. Like Seema pointed out that the Ganikas were actually kind of people who were, or the current, or to our 20th century itself, Devdasis were the ones who were exploited, and so that is there. But what I wanted to bring in as a dimension to the discussion is the aspect of caste. Caste is a reality as far as Indian Hindu Brahminical world is concerned. So in which the Nagarika class, the Kshatriya Brahmin, the merchants, were of course privileged. So a lot of these things were available to them. Whereas there is no way one can imagine that the outcasts or the lower castes were in any way close even to this kind of knowledge or this kind of culture. They had a kind of, these are kind of segregated world as far as ancient and medieval India is concerned, I would say. Certain changes definitely came in with the coming of Islamic rule in India, but that also could not completely kind of change it into a classless society or casteless society. Hindu Brahminical religion was so very dominant. It discriminated people. If it discriminated women, it also discriminated people on the basis of their caste. So it was not these kind of pleasures and this kind of propitiation and this kind of celebration was hardly part of the so-called, if I call it, common man's life or laborer's life, or a, you know, folk, village folk, lives of village folk. So I think it is time for us to reconcile with that fact, you know, that this was, of course, of the Nagaras, of the urban city dwellers, you know, Kama Sutra to all courtly pleasures that are mentioned, you know. But of course, there was a concern about agriculture and propitiation of fertility and a celebration of copulation as such. So there was no stigma about that. But to have these things on the temple was considered to be auspicious. I mean, that means actually there are theories that these sculptures of eroticism was kept on the temple walls to ward off evil and kind of thing. I don't quite agree with that. On the other hand, it was celebratory and propitiation of this thing. And of course, thank you for bringing in that dimension of class and gender in this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor. Dr. Pandey, please.
Anirudh, I actually went with the title Sex in Stone. So may I show some 8 slides where I want to just present what I see as an unbroken tradition for 13 years, where you have all these multiple or multivocal kind of voices through text, through image, and through philosophy. So I want to actually...
Professor, sorry, Dr. Pandey, just a quick time check. So we have 25 minutes remaining. So, and we haven't taken any audience questions yet. So the sooner that we can...
I'll take 5 minutes.
Yes. Okay, wonderful.
Yes.
Eva, if you could please pull the slides up.
There are 8 slides and I'll take less than 5 minutes, but I just do want to just show that how India is so inclusive, and we have all these issues, you know, these layers of gender, sexuality. I don't want to limit myself to the Kama Sutra itself, and I want to go beyond. So Eva, if you could just run it through, and I'll just talk very quickly with this 1st century Kushana dynasty image, actually, of Ayagapatta, which is a religious plaque decorated with auspicious symbols. And the portrait, actually, the sculpture shows a male Vyala with a flowing mass of writhing serpents. And of course, you see a kind of phallic shape, an image of in almost in a fellatio thing. This is from the Mathura Museum, carved in red sandstone. The next image is one of the most, I would say, a very, very powerful image, which I love, which is a Lajja Gauri. In fact, the 2 names itself, Lajja, which could also be shame, Gauri, which is a woman. And this is actually, this image goes between, you know, a goddess and a woman. She's a powerful Shakti showing her yoni or her vulva, and she is associated with various symbols. She could be fertility, fecundity, magic, of great agricultural abundance, because a lot of these Lajja Gauris have been found from the 2nd century before the Common Era in terracotta images to the 9th century of the Common Era. The next image I wanted to show, very different to the images from Khajuraho. This is a Maithun or cup or lovers. This is an ivory sculpture. Can we have the next image, please? This is from, this is from the Meenakshi temple in Madurai. And This is, of course, the Meenakshi Sundareshwar temple. It is on the banks of the Vaiga river in the temple city of Madurai, dedicated to the goddess Meenakshi, a form of Parvati, and her consort Shiva in the form of Sundareshwara. Now, what we see here is the man and the woman, as you can see, as Seema had also said earlier, and I will also say in a lot of our vernacular received wisdom, the pleasure of the woman is as much important as that of a male. And you see a kind of an equality. The woman is unabashed, she's in a Tribhanga Mudra, and the male, the Shiva, is caressing the cheeks of the woman. Next, I come to a wonderful image from Aihole in Karnataka, 8th century. And what you see here, though of course the temple is dedicated to Surya, it is named Durga because of the Durga, the fortified kind of temple, a fortified structure around the temple. And what you also see here is a man and a woman, again, in a very, very close embrace, in a state of sexual coming together. Next, I want to show an image from the 11th century, and this is actually a work of my doctoral work, which I did on the Ardha Nari Ishwara, where you see a coming together of the two, sexes of the two, a kind of a coalescing of the two genders, of the male and the female, of Purush and Prakriti. And this is from the early Chola Nadu style, from the 9th to the 11th century of the Common Era. I particularly like this next image. This is of Marichi, who's portrayed in all her glory as the Shakti, the consort of Vairodhana, 11th century Pala period. And what you see here is the woman, her presence is really formidable. She wears a highly decorative crown, which covers her 3 heads, and she's in a chariot driven by 7 galloping young sows, and she speeds across the night sky as the sun ascends in the morning sky. This imagery is typical on the eastern region, decorative jewelry, and the woman is shown in all her beautiful form. I now go back to the Parsavnath temple in Khajuraho, a beautiful image again of a man and a woman, 10th century or 11th century. And what you see here is in a Jain temple, you see a man and a woman in an alingan, in a very, very close embrace. And I come to my last image, which I love. This is a dancing Natesa from Rani Pokhari in Nepal. And what you see here is Shiva as a dancing Shiva. His left leg rests on the back of the lion and the right leg on the back of a seated bull. There's an ornate Prabha Mandal, or the halo behind the head, and is foregrounded with a Jata Mukuta on the male side and a small snake in 3 coils as an earring. There is a presence of an ornate mekhla which holds aloft a feminine drape, and therefore this becomes an Ardhanari Natesan, as we all know that it is Shiva, Nata Raja, the king of dance. But it is to Parvati that it is said, if you look at it from a Shaivite philosophy, that he taught her the feminine form of dance, which is Lasya. So without the Veer and the Lasya, the dance cannot be complete. And I go back to my original statement or theory that there has to be, for a civil society, for a great governance, for peace and harmony, there has to be a balance in the sexes, a balance in society, a balance in gender, and a balance in sexuality. And that's how I'd like to end my presentation for this talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Pandey. So if I could tie together what Professor Pandika was saying with your presentation as well, I think what I found very interesting about the images you showed is that across this wide swathe of time and place, you see elites across the Indian subcontinent producing these like remarkable depictions of eroticism, and this completely unabashed love for the human form. But as just to add in the perspective that you brought in, Professor Panikar, it is difficult to say how deep this engagement and this belief and how widespread this belief was in ancient and medieval India, especially once you start thinking about it along the lines of gender, along the lines of caste. And an additional perspective that I'd like to segue to, which of course will bring us to the audience questions, is of queer people in India's history. Are there any sculptures representing same-sex love, for example? And if I could actually add on to that, would these pre-modern Indians have thought about sexuality the same way that we do today? Professor Panikar, please.
The thing is that this whole idea of queerness, or even the category of LGBT is very modern. I mean, that is not the framework with which one in the ancient or medieval India things existed. If you actually don't look at the LGBTQ identity issues and the related, struggles that we live today. If you rummage through the ancient and medieval literature and art, you will find seamless flow of these kind of things. There's a male who is so effeminate in today's, no Indian man is so masculine in that sense of the, term. There is always that feminine grace. There's that beauty. I mean, these are terms which are very problematic, I'm saying. And this is only kind of for using today's vocabulary. Otherwise, men had been equally graceful and beautiful. And sexuality was considered as a kind of a continuity rather than as compartmentalized. I mean, so there was no much of a, there are representations of male to male, female to female sex, even animal and man contacts, sexual contacts are represented, especially speaking about Khajuraho. I myself have noticed a couple of images of these images. Now, do they represent the practices in that sense of a locatable, identifiable, nameable kind of thing? That is actually a problem, because these existed in the world of pleasure making as a kind of form of, this is my understanding of it. Now, for instance, even in the Mughal period, when Madhav and this Muslim Sufi saint were in love and they were actually doing sexual acts, they were not punished, or the Muslim man was not punished for having sex with another man, but he was punished for drinking in public. He was punished for drinking in public, So there was no stigma in that sense. The whole shame culture that we have in 20th and 21st century that we have, or developed from 19th century, is completely Western. Not Indian.
I agree with you. No, I totally agree with what you just said, Shivaji, because I was just going to say that there's lots of sculptures. Of course, my field is stories. You have any number of stories of people being together. There aren't any divisions. And yes, I will go back to your previous point that this was for the upper classes. It wasn't for the lower classes. And yes, there is a caste system involved. Yes, unfortunately, that is very much there. But the idea of sexuality was very fluid. It wasn't specifically, it had to be this or that. It generated from one from the other.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think it's very important to remember that the way that we think about sexuality, identity, gender, all of these have been very profoundly shaped not just by the colonial experience, but also by the way that the West has thought about gender and sexuality over the last few decades, which has had a very profound impact on the way that we see all of these things. So thank you for that question, Nisha. A question from the Museum of Eroticism. Is it possible to draw a parallel in a way? In the contemporary world, we have bold erotic art and literature that are comfortable, that cause discomfort among the common people. They give the example of Ranveer Singh's nude photo shoot, but a certain class of people consider it as art and patronize or commission it. So in the same way, are erotic sculptures of ancient temples patronized by kings who understood it, but for common man, was it taboo? Would they have had other priorities in life? And they would request a perspective from all the panelists if you would like to weigh in.
I would say that the word taboo is a more way of looking, a contemporary lens being put on work which was created maybe 1,000 years ago, or 1,500 years ago, or whatever time it was created. These sculptures actually represent the Zeitgeist. They actually represent the spirit of the times. And I would not like to use the word taboo for them. They were very much part and parcel of the living heritage of that time. They are very much part of the intangible heritage of our times. And using the word taboo is not something which I'm very comfortable with. I think we have to accept it as part of, as I said, the zeitgeist of the times.
I think at every point in time, there have been people who thought differently. So as Alka said, this was the thinking of the time. This is how they thought. This was how people generally believed that life should be, but there was bound to be somebody out there who didn't think it was okay. I think right now, the narrative that's being put upon us is actually being put upon us. It's not how most people would think or react to something. I think that it's being driven.
I would like to say that we do not know what lower caste thought about these things, or how they lived their sexuality, or what were the values. The thing is that we have no much sources to kind of trace those histories. Either they made things in perishable material, or they have not left much of written sources, or we have to kind of make conjectures about how people would have lived their lives, thought about these things, etc. So we do not know enough about the pre-modern common people, or people of lower strata of the society. Now, coming to today's, because there was the question was also about Ranveer Singh, we posting himself as nude, very beautiful. He is very beautiful. It could be appreciated, but certain kind of stigma, or certain kind of, imbibed from the colonial times, and also kind of lived very, very truthfully. I will not kind of doubt that things like something like Swaminarayan temples that have been built, the contemporary modern temples built by through all the shastras, etc., where you do not see this kind of beautiful bodies. You find all clothed, all covered up, all pardafied. So we are living in a kind of another world, completely, because we have knowledge, so we can look at it a little more, with clarity and understand things. But common man definitely are mixed up kind of thing, with about a nude goddesses. Now, when the nude goddesses issue came up in Baroda in 2007, I had interacted with the vice chancellor then, who was actually a Swaminarayan follower. He said that is of the past. Now, let's talk about the today. Today, we don't accept it. Today's Hinduism do not accept it. So they sit on Hinduism, deciding what Hindus should be, right? So that is actually the kind of dynamics that creates this kind of problem of contemporary, where sex and body and sexuality, etc., becomes some kind of a taboo, something to be kept out. So this is a problematic, that this is not easily sorted out in that sense. It's a kind of a struggle that one is going through in today's life.
Completely agree, Professor. Thank you for that very frank and honest answer. Now moving to a question that is related to sexuality and sexual health, but not very much in the domain of art history. I just thought it was quite interesting. What do we know about how STIs, abortions, and contraceptives were located in Indian history, especially during the times of the Kama Sutra?
Especially the time
of the Kama Sutra.
The Kama Sutra.
I think it was very much part of indigenous wisdom. And I think a lot of local, who we call dais and midwives, they knew about these. In the chapter on the aphrodisiacs, which is the last book of the Kama Sutra, there are various portions and how should I say, instruments which were used for enhancing pleasure. In the same way, I am only surmising that there would also be ways and means of contraceptives, natural contraceptives, because when you look at Ayurveda, you also see, I'm not an expert on Ayurveda, but I do know that certain, they say, I'm not sure how much of scientific reason there is, but certain fruits, certain foods, which have a proclivity towards abortioning a young fetus, there are all these things. So I'm sure there must be a deep science and a deep rationalism, because I believe a lot in that, in traditional wisdom. There must have been, solutions and answers for all these.
I have a slightly different take on that question. Because the consideration was to have more population. I mean, we are living in a kind of a time when we are preoccupied with control, but those were the days when people wanted more children, 15 children, 20 children, 8 children, 8 for a woman. It was very normal, right? So,
but also I think, Shivaji, you're talking in terms of the different women. So the wife may have been expected to have many children, but the courtesan, the Ganika,
Ganikas also could have their own children, right? Their own children.
Could, but
because that is also adding to the society. This notion of bastard, is, I doubt whether it existed. She was.
You're absolutely right. I don't think that necessarily existed. And yes, there was a need for them to also have some children, but maybe not quite as many. But yes, as Alka said, it would have been there. It's just that the Kama Sutra mentions a couple of things. They don't really go into details about contraception. Like Shivaji says, these are preoccupations that we have today rather than.
That's right. That's right. Contraception probably was not that kind of a preoccupation for ancient or medieval Indians.
And also, you have to remember that the text, a lot of the texts, particularly the Kama Sutra, they were written to teach men. Women in those days weren't taught how to read or write. These were written for men and to teach men how to live their best life. And this wasn't a worry that the men would ever have had. It wasn't their problem to deal with. So
that's a very important perspective, is to the fact that this is not a problem that the writers of the text are going to bother with. So we have no idea from the text what women would have been doing.
I mean, there's a story about King Minos of Crete that they say that he had what they call poisonous semen, and that whenever he had sex with any of the women that he was from his concubines, that they would die from the poison. And clearly he just had a really, really bad STI of some kind, or some kind of venereal disease that was really bad. And apparently the very first condom was created for him. Now this is legend, whether it's actually there or not, but it's a very well-known story about him. So I'm sure these things were there. They were just not necessary for the man to worry about.
All right. There's so many more interesting questions which I would have loved to get into, but I'm afraid we are almost out of time. So Shilpa, what do you say? Shall we wrap up, or do you think we have time for one more question?
I think you can take one more question.
Yeah. One more question. Okay. I found this interesting again because it's a little bit of modern attitudes, but also brings up interesting perspectives about the Khajuraho sculptures. Do the Khajuraho sculptures show a diversity of body types? or is there an ideal quote unquote sexy body type there too?
It's one. I'm sorry, most of it. I think I might have found 3 sculptures that were slightly different. It's very, yeah, the sexy body type.
I think the only, sorry, go ahead, Dr. Pandey.
I think it was part of the Shilpa Shastras of the moment, and the Khajuraho sculptures were of that region, and they were a kind of a post-classical Gupta period, and they had this idealized form of a woman, full-breasted, narrow-waisted, large childbearing hips. So this was the norm of that time, and I think most of the sculptors stuck to that pattern.
All right, Professor Panikar, any closing remarks?
Well, thank you very much. It would be nice if you sum up some of these discussions.
Okay, of course. Thank you all my fellow panelists, for all these fascinating perspectives. Having read all of your work, it's so exciting to actually have these conversations with you. I hope I wasn't being too cheeky with my questions about caste and caste discrimination, and especially misogyny. But overall, I think my biggest takeaway from all of this is pervasiveness of the erotic ideal throughout Indian history, the fact that it was seen as very much a part of the natural world and there was no shame attached to it, and of course the fact that they're not necessarily think about gender and sexuality using any of the vocabulary that we do today, but rather in more simplistic terms or I think simple is probably a better word, more simple terms of reproduction, fertility, and of course pleasure. So once again, thank you all for joining me. Thank you to the CSGS and MAP for hosting this, and thank you all of you for attending this session.